B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, August 23rd, 2019. Right here in San Francisco, the Democratic National Committee is holding a 3-day conference. And it started with a real stinker. As I reported yesterday, there was strong resistance to the idea of a sanctioned presidential candidate debate focused exclusively on climate change. And in a stunning vote yesterday, the Rules Committee of the DNC rejected the idea by a vote of 17-8. And I find this stunning on so many levels. We'll get to the global crisis, but this is an opportunity, a missed opportunity, for Democrats to brand their party and their candidates as the side that believes that climate change is a threat to human life on the planet, and that we must take bold and immediate action to address it. And the lame excuses offered by party leaders, including those who have been aligned with Bernie Sanders in the past, is just outrageous. And the lame excuse we get is that, gosh, if we allowed a focused debate limited to the topic of climate change, what about people who want their own debate about gun issues, about the elderly, about racial issues? What are we going to tell them? And I find that so unpersuasive, because the party has the opportunity to make these decisions. And I think most people, even those who are single-issue voters who care about abortion rights, contraception, family planning, there's so many issues, right? And if we simply rely on the networks who hold the debates and their overpaid anchors to direct the questioning along specific topic lines, all we get is the kind of bullshit we've seen in the debates so far, where they try to find differences between the candidates on, say, healthcare policy and turn it into some sort of a controversial debate instead of one that really helps voters understand the positions of the candidates and what they would try to do. And Tad Devine is one of the people who has advised Al Gore and, in 2016, Bernie Sanders. He said to amend these rules now after having enforced them throughout this primary process would be putting our thumb on the scale. It's really condescending. And I want to credit Kevin Gosztola, as ever, at Shadowproof. He focused on Simone Sanders. You may recall she was hired by Bernie Sanders back in 2016 as an advisor when Bernie was experiencing some trouble connecting with the African-American community. She is now a senior advisor to one Joe Biden. And she says that it's dangerous territory to try to change course in the middle of the Democratic primary process. Now, I do recognize that after the debacle of 2016, when Bernie Sanders was routinely cheated by the leaders of the Democratic Party, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the finance arm of the DNC, and, of course, they poisoned the media. Remember the claim that a Bernie bro had thrown a chair at a caucus in Las Vegas? That was amplified by the corporate media, which, of course, didn't amplify the fact that it never happened, that it wasn't true. So here is a Florida DNC member, Craig Smith, who had a vote in this. How do I get back to my neighbors who lost kids at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and explain to them why they don't get a special debate on guns? I mean, this is grade school stuff. And to her credit, Nancy Pelosi's daughter, Christine, who is very active in the Democratic Party, she introduced the amendment for a climate debate, said to Simone Sanders, Do you want to propose an amendment to have a gun violence debate? Because if you propose it, I'll support it. And what would be the harm in holding debates around specific topic areas, including gun violence and racial relations? I'd throw in war policy, Pentagon budget. There are a lot of ways that the DNC could make these debates much more valuable, if only, again, in marketing terms, to separate the Democratic Party and its candidates from the Republicans, the deniers, those who have squandered 4 years by increasing our output of fossil fuel pollution. Al Gore appeared here in San Francisco. He's got a condo here. He said the DNC's decision to sabotage a climate debate is extremely disappointing. Voters all over the country are demanding we focused on the biggest threat to our nation and humanity's future and prioritize solving the climate crisis instead of continuing business as usual. And I've got my issues with Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, who has ignored the yellow vest protests as much as he possibly can. And there are a lot of ways to criticize Macron, like the way he came to Washington and put 1,000 kisses on Trump's rump. But his goal was to get Trump to stay in the Iranian nuclear agreement. So I'll forgive him for that. Well, there is a meeting in France this weekend of the Group of Seven, and both the French president and Angela Merkel of Germany have said that these out-of-control fires in the Amazon should be added to the agenda. This is an international crisis. And Macron, who is getting pushback from the hardline new president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, who yesterday was blaming environmentalists for starting the fires so that they could shoot video and embarrass him. Well, he's backed off from that, and he's actually acknowledged that Brazil does not have the resources to combat this record level of fires in the Amazon. Will he accept some sort of international aid? Well, probably not. So Macron tweeted yesterday, "Our house is burning, literally. The Amazon rainforest, the lungs which produce 20% of our planet's oxygen, on fire. It is an international crisis." And to add a little element of leverage, Macron is saying that he is reconsidering an agreement that has been hammered out over years between France and Brazil. It's a trade deal. And he issued this statement, "Given Brazil's attitude over the past weeks and a claim that Bolsonaro lied to him at the last meeting in Osaka related to addressing climate change issues, well, Macron is threatening to pull out of that trade agreement." Now, this is a muscular response to a critical issue. And compare that to the Democratic leaders who say, "Oh, no, it might piss off other members of the party if we held a debate solely on climate change." It's really infuriating. Meanwhile, the trade war with China is intensifying. We're in the neener zone now. You know, Trump announced all these tariffs, and then he delayed them until December to try to ease the impact on American consumers. Well, Beijing has responded with retaliatory tariffs on about $75 billion of American goods imported into China. The most dramatic is a 25% import on auto products and automobiles. So Trump is infuriated, and he issued a royal decree by Twitter today, a royal tweet. I guess that King of Israel thing has really gone to his head. And he is demanding now that American companies cut ties with China. He has absolutely no authority to do this. And will the captains of corporate America fall in line and say, Oh, yes, dear leader, dear tweeter, whatever you say. So, couple of tweets today. Our great American companies are hereby ordered to immediately start looking for an alternative to China, including bringing your companies home and making your products in the USA. Who is he kidding? He went on, I will be responding to China's tariffs this afternoon. Well, I don't have that update for you, sorry. And then he spins it. This is a great opportunity for the United States. And then he tagged that with an order to all carriers, including FedEx, Amazon, UPS, and the Post Office, to search packages coming in from China looking for fentanyl. Now, it's been discovered that the U.S. Postal Service is one of the leading ways that the illegal drug is smuggled into the United States. And Trump imagines that he is so powerful that he can just tweet these commands and that everyone will fall in line. It is so bizarre. In the meantime, Trump is now attacking once again the man that he appointed to be chair of the National Board of the Federal Reserve. And keep in mind, he dumped Obama's appointee and put Jay Powell in this position. And Powell is now kind of reeling from these almost daily attacks on Twitter. But Trump really went beyond his previous criticisms of Chairman Powell. And one of his tweets today ended this way. My only question is, who is our bigger enemy, Jay Powell or Chairman Xi of China? Now, this kind of imperious, emotional, arbitrary behavior, where he believes that he can just publicly insult and pillory the head of the Federal Reserve and pressure him into actions that the Fed does not want to take. And get this, the current interest rate is 2.25%. And the Fed has signaled that at its September meeting, it will shave a quarter point off of that, bring it to 2%. But Trump essentially wants free money. Now, part of that is that he has added $1 trillion to the national debt, to the annual deficit, and we're paying almost half, it's about $450 billion, so almost $500 billion a year in interest payments on that rising federal debt. Now, I'm not a total deficit hawk, but I must call out the hypocrisy of Republicans who only care about the deficit when there is a black Democrat in the White House. And if indeed we are facing a recession, which based on the metrics is increasingly likely, cutting the interest rates now will give us no stimulus effect to help revive the sick economy that has been brought to its knees by Trump's trade wars. They're talking about things like, a payroll tax cut that would put a few dollars a week in the average person's pocket, or administrative efforts that don't appear to be legal to shave the capital gains tax that investors pay when they sell stocks or property. And so we are running the economy at top RPM, and we are running it either into a wall or over a cliff. Choose your painful metaphor. But we're doing so at the highest speed possible, meaning that the damage will be greater and the efforts at recovery will be that much more challenging. I guess we need a democratic debate on trade policy and what powers the president should or shouldn't have. Because I really would love to see Congress trying to rein in Trump's mercurial use of tariffs and his claim that it's all about national security. Meanwhile, because of the impasse related to trade, Trump, who for the last 6 weeks or so has postured as neutral regarding the pro-democracy rallies in Hong Kong. And maybe he was posturing because there are U.S. influences to the Hong Kong leadership, and there could be even U.S. operatives on the ground. We have operated that way in the past, and so to assume that it's not happening now would be probably a mistake. So, in recent days, Trump has shifted his stance to show greater solidarity with the pro-democracy protesters. But this is transactional on his part. He primarily sees it as greater leverage on Beijing. And when he starts to talk about being humane, and he gets his Vice President, Mike Pence, to say, oh, it'll be much harder for us to make a deal with Beijing if something violent happens in Hong Kong. These are the humanitarians who showed their stripes with Venezuela in February of this year. And so they are completely free of credibility when they address humanitarian and small d democratic movements. And I consider this just for show, but the government of Hong Kong has charged 2 men with rioting over the mob attack on the train station outside Hong Kong last month. Now, we're told that as many as 20 people have been arrested, 2 have been charged. But there were more than 100 men dressed in white shirts with their faces masked, wielding sticks and metal bars, attacking protesters, and they are thought to be members of the Chinese equivalent of Antifa, which is the triad gangs. Here's another area of destabilization that I link to the Trump administration and to his freewheeling and unhinged foreign policy approach. And I'm talking about what is now extending into 3 weeks of a total lockdown of Kashmir by the Indian government led by nationalist Narendra Modi. There are at least 2,000 Kashmiris. That's just an estimate because the phone lines and the internet have been blocked from Kashmir for this entire time. And the New York Times has a good explainer. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast, where they explain how they started rounding people up before the announcement of the unilateral change in what is called Section 370, I think, of the Indian Constitution. That's what gave special status to Kashmir. And the Times does a good job of explaining that this has been in the works for at least a year. And the Modi scheme started by declaring that Kashmir had a vacancy in its leadership. They needed to set new elections. Then one of the Kashmiri leaders said she was ready to form a party and stage elections, and then they kept postponing the date. That meant there was no functioning state assembly when Modi revoked Kashmir's autonomy on August 5th. His government claimed that in the absence of a state assembly, which they had engineered, the central government had the power to do this. So this is clearly a staged effort that is extra legal. I'm not at all familiar with Indian law and its constitution, but the experts who are cited in this article make it very clear. Here is a Kashmiri lawyer, quote, "These detentions are totally illegal and unconstitutional." And we hear silence. I haven't heard much from the United Nations. I haven't heard an American political leader of either party protest this destabilizing move by the muscular Hindu nationalism of the Modi government. And it's interesting, in New York, I was in New York last Sunday when there was a parade down, it was either Broadway or Madison Avenue, observing the Independence Day of India. I believe it was in 1947. And so it was a Bollywood-style parade. A lot of it was not political. And then a group of people wearing MAGA hats, who appeared to be of Indian ethnicity, came by, and one of the observers of the parade, a woman who appeared to be of Indian ethnicity, engaged one of the MAGA guys. And she was shouting at him, "Don't you have any shame? How can you support Trump? He hates immigrants." But Trump has been silent and given tacit approval to India's grab of Kashmir. This, of course, heightens tensions with Pakistan. And according to the Associated Press, the propaganda machinery, the Bollywood machinery in India was already primed and ready to roll with new elements of what's called patriotism pop, flooding social media about nationalism and the country's burgeoning right-wing ideology. And there are some music videos that promote the idea of Hindus from India moving to Kashmir to marry Kashmir women. And Kashmiris have pushed back, saying this is rooted in patriarchy that objectifies and dehumanizes Kashmiris. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Great people like Andrew Harnack, Polina Vasilev, Janet Price, and Peter Hoffmeister. They each kick in $5 or $10 a month, the cost of a cheap lunch or an appetizer at dinner. And I invite you to join them. I need your help to sustain my work, and it validates my work when you kick in a few bucks a month. So come on over to peterbcollins.com. You can even pause this podcast while you take care of business. You click on the menu tab, then click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and from there you can choose the level of support that's comfortable for you. And I look forward to seeing new subscriptions registered very soon. We're getting confirmation that back in July, the Israeli military staged a bombing raid in Iraq. Now, this violates the sovereignty of Iraq. Israel, for whatever reason, stayed out of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq, and it's been nearly 4 decades since an Israeli assault on the nation of Iraq. They claim, and this is a kind of veiled statement from Benjamin Netanyahu speaking in Kyiv, Ukraine on Monday. He said, Iran doesn't have immunity anywhere. A state that says we're going to destroy you and we will build bases to fire missiles and send terrorist cells against you, as far as I'm concerned, has no immunity. We will act and currently are acting against them wherever it is necessary. Now, this is another breakdown of diplomatic and international norms. I believe that this is another example of power grabs by regional leaders because they know Trump will not object. He won't impose a human rights frame. He won't attempt to enforce treaties or international obligations because he don't care. And, of course, he has that special relationship with Netanyahu where they meddle in each other's elections. And so it goes. Last night, I finally got a chance to see Bill Maher's HBO show from last Friday night. I had seen the clips circulating on Facebook of his rant against boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, aimed at Israel. And I found his rant to be inconsistent with his general views and largely incoherent. Because as soon as he introduced his panel, this was the first topic that he brought up. And during his opening monologue, his joke sequence, he had actually indicated that he objected to Israel's bar of entry to Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. But then when he got to the panel, he basically primed them with an attack on BDS. And he had a milquetoast panel. Carl Hulse is this longtime Capitol Hill reporter for the New York Times. He didn't take the bait. Then there was this former Trump supporter who's a Republican against Trump, Stevens, I think Rick Stevens. And then there was a young woman who is somehow linked to NBC. I'd never heard of her before. And they didn't take his bait. And he said, okay, well, if you won't talk about it. And then he obviously had rehearsed comments. Perhaps you've heard him describe BDS as some kind of a bullshit purity test. And his ignorance and Islamophobia weigh equally here, because he displayed a support for Zionism that is quite remarkable for a guy who claims to be the leading public atheist in the United States. And I could see him taking an even-handed position of saying, well, both sides are driven by what he considers to be religious extremism, Zionism on the Israeli side and Islam on the Palestinian side. That's not terribly accurate, but I wouldn't be surprised if he said something like that. But his attack on BDS and lecturing people because they hadn't paid attention in history class, he's the one who needs to pay attention. He went to some cue cards to read a comment from Omar Barghouti, who he proceeded to slime. Barghouti, one of the co-founders of the BDS movement, is a man I respect. I've met and interviewed him. And Bill Maher clearly doesn't know what he's talking about. Then, in his final segment, which he calls New Rules, he was railing against what he considers to be politically correct limits on free speech, failing to recognize his own hypocrisy, that BDS is a form of speech. I am choosing not to steer my dollars in any way that would support the extreme apartheid Zionist government in Israel. And it is my right to do so. Bill Maher is a mess. And I do watch his show because it's political commentary that is timely, and occasionally he brings people on who have interesting perspectives. And often Bill Maher can be very funny. But when he gets into his Islamophobic zone, it needs to be called out. Meanwhile, the Justice Department this week sent out a weekly briefing to judges who serve on immigration courts. And as you may know, these judges don't have the same independence of, say, a lifetime appointee to a federal district court. They work for the Justice Department, and that's why our immigration courts are kangaroo courts. At any rate, the Justice Department's Executive Office for Immigration Review sent their employees a weekly memo that included a link to a blog post from a site called VDare, a white nationalist website. And the union who represents these judges complained. The post features links and content that directly attacks sitting immigration judges with racial and ethnically tinged slurs and the label Critarch. And I'd never seen this. We're going to define it for you in a moment. The reference to Critarch in a negative tone is deeply offensive and anti-Semitic. The VDare post includes pictures of judges with the term Critarch, spelled Kritarch, preceding their names. It is a reference, Critarch, or Critarchy, to ancient Israel during a time of rule by a system of judges. As I said, I've never heard of this before, and I don't know the depth of this as an anti-Semitic slur. But it's truly bizarre that the Justice Department would send that out. They're claiming a contractor prepared that memo, and they really regret that it was sent out. Here's an important ruling from the U.S. Court of Appeals sitting in Denver. That's the 10th Circuit. In 2016, one of the members of the Electoral College, representing voters in Colorado, named Michael Baca, a Democrat, decided to exercise his own discretion. As a Democrat, he was expected to cast his Electoral College vote for Hillary Rodham Clinton. But instead, he wrote in the name of John Kasich, a Republican who was Ohio's governor at the time and was the more moderate Republican who stayed in the race long after Trump had sewed things up in 2016. Well, the court ruling reads, the text of the Constitution makes clear that states do not have the constitutional authority to interfere with presidential electors who exercise their constitutional right to vote for the president and vice president candidates of their choice. Now, the term of art, the legal term here, is that Michael Baca was a faithless elector. And back in the post-election period, before the Electoral College met, there was a scramble of Democrats who wanted to be released from their obligation to vote so that they could vote essentially against Trump. And get this, there were 7 faithless electors in 2016 because by the vote count, Trump was entitled to 306 electoral votes and Hillary 232, but in the end he got 304 and she got 227. So this is legal. It has implications that could go either way depending on how you want the election to come out. But I believe that it was a missed opportunity, a failed safety valve that Democrats passed on in December of 2016. Well, no heads have rolled, but 15 employees at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City, where we are told Jeffrey Epstein killed himself by suicide. Well, some have been reassigned. The warden, the head of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, reassigned. The 2 staff members who slept their way through Epstein's reputed final night are accused of falsely recording in a log that they had checked on Epstein every 30 minutes, even while they were sleeping. And so this is a Keystone Cops comedy of errors, and most of us, if you're like me, will remain skeptical of the official narrative that Jeffrey Epstein took his life with no help or assistance from anyone else. And until we see video footage that actually shows him wrapping a sheet around his neck and this improbable claim that he could get enough action on his neck to break it from a bunk just by kneeling, I mean, the whole narrative is very hard to buy. The Nebraska Supreme Court issued a ruling today giving its approval of the revised route through Nebraska of the Keystone XL pipeline run by TransCanada. That's not the final word. The federal lawsuit brought by our friends of the North Coast River Alliance and others is still working its way through the federal courts in Montana. But this is another obstacle removed from the path of that crude oil carbon bomb from Canada into the U.S. Well, yesterday, people were outraged that Sarah Huckabee Sanders had landed a lucrative gig telling her lies on the Fox News channel. And, of course, that was applauded by all people with the name of Trump. But today, Don Jr. is apoplectic, and he's tweeting all over the place because Andrew McCabe, who was the former number 2 to James Comey at the FBI, became acting director for a while, and then was fired by Trump hours before he would have qualified for his pension. I'm no fan of Andy McCabe. He's been hired by CNN. And I trust him only slightly more than Sarah Huckabee Sanders. In my view, neither one of them belongs as a commentator on a cable network in this country. And finally today, David H. Koch, the billionaire industrialist, the guy who pumped millions, if not billions, of his inherited fortune into right-wing and libertarian causes. He's died at the age of 79, and he is survived by his brother Charles, who continues the family efforts to rewrite the country as a pure and simple oligarchy. Thanks for joining me today for my News and Comment podcast. You can share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet betrayed.